this is what we're going to cover. I hope this is what you're expecting from the publicity we sent out. What is action learning? How can it be applied? What are the benefits both to individuals and to organisations? And then a chance for your questions. So I'm planning to talk for about 20 minutes, and then the rest of the time will be for your questions. So I'm Ruth Cook. I'm the Managing Director of Action Learning Associates. We're about to celebrate our 20th birthday. We've been going for 20 years. Just so you know, it really is me. Got the camera on for a moment. So I hope I don't look too different from the photo that was a good few years ago. We don't keep video on during the webinar. We know that it reduces the quality for everyone, and some people may have limited bandwidth. So I'm going to turn the camera off and ask you to think about what you want from this session. So again, we've still got people joining us, which is great. Welcome to those people who just joined. And can I ask you to spend a minute thinking about what you want from today? You know, why are you here? And how can you get the most out of the session? So what do you need to do to be fully present, and just so that you're focused on what you need from it? What do you want to go away with at the end? I'll just give you a minute for that. Okay, let's start with what is action learning. So action learning, as many of you know, is a form of self-managed learning. In other words, in other words, there isn't a curriculum, there isn't a body of knowledge that you're trying to impart as a facilitator of action learning, but each person participating decides what they would most like to get out of it. What's the focus for them in terms of their learning? And then we use a very structured process for reflecting on experience. And it's always a group process, so it's a small group of peers who meet over a period of time and follow a fairly strict, disciplined, rigorous process for reflecting on their experience. So it's very different from standard conversations. It's not discussion. We don't go backwards and forwards between different participants. The process focuses on one person at a time, who talks about something that a challenge they're facing, an opportunity that's been opened up for them, a plan that they have, a problem that they're dealing with perhaps, and the participants have to follow the discipline of not offering advice. So we all know how often our minds just go towards finding a solution and a desire to help somebody, but actually this is not advice. The core technique is one of a coaching technique, basically, of asking questions that probe and explore and help the participant work out what their own action is, what do they need to do. So it isn't just someone telling their story, but someone who's I've just seen a note from Becky that anyone else's sound breaking up, so it may be your connection, Becky, but has anyone else got a problem? Please let me know if this is a problem for others. But meanwhile, so it's okay for some people and not for others. So it may be the connection at your end. Sorry about that. For those who are having a problem, and it may improve as time goes on. So this is based on the core technique of coaching and feedback. So after the person has come to their action, the process that we use means that every person in the action learning set or the action learning group offers a reflection or some feedback to the person who has presented an issue. And that can be extremely useful, both for learning good feedback skills, but also for people receiving feedback on what they've heard or how they've come across. So that's a 1 minute version of what action learning is. And of course, we could spend the whole webinar exploring that, and we have done on other occasions. But in particular, we want to talk this time about applications of action learning. So you can find out more on our website about action learning. I'll just summarize it again here, that the process is one person describing a situation or a challenge, and then gaining clarity from the questions that are asked. We hope skillful questions that explore the underlying assumptions that people have made in their presentation. And then options are explored, and the presenter, decides on their action. And then, very importantly, they report back on their action at a later meeting. So action learning is always a process that's carried on over a period of time. And in a way, the person who's received all that attention from the group is accountable to them for doing the actions that they've said they'll do. So they report back on progress at a later meeting. And obviously, as a set continues over time, it may continue for a year. Sometimes sets continue for very many years. People get to know each other really well, and can report back on actions that may actually take them some time to fulfill, or feedback that they may have received before from participants. So yeah, there's a great deal of knowledge and trust that builds up over time. So this is the core of what we're going to cover today, and I've got this slide to run through all of the applications, or most of the applications where we use action learning. And I'm going to give you some examples as we go along, because I think that will make it more real for you. To start with, and I think it was the starting point for action learning, it was used originally a lot for individual development. So a classic would be to use action learning as part of a leadership development programme. We're working with the Greater London Authority at the moment, and they've got senior managers who are going through a leadership programme with us providing some input in the mornings, and then in the afternoons, them working in action learning sets, talking about how do I implement the learning from this programme? How does it apply to me as a manager? What do I need to do? Another use would be anywhere where you want to embed the learning. So again, we often know as trainers that it's what happens when people go back after a training programme that is crucial, and you can use action learning to follow up to any learning programme and make sure people are doing what they say, or share their challenges in implementation. Another aspect of individual development is a reflective space. Some structured thinking time enables people to think more critically, more creatively. I quite often run sets that are cross-sector. So people who are at a similar level, maybe chief executive or director level, but a space where they really get challenged about what they're doing, and they really get time to think. Another aspect of individual development is that it can be it can be skills development in relation to reflective practice. I think we've probably got some participants here from NSPCC, and they're using action learning for this purpose within the organisation. We work a lot with people who are doing training for qualified social workers, and encouraging the skill of reflective development is reflective practice is very helpful in their development. Coaching skills would be another example. Supporting mentors who are building their coaching skills. Problem solving. People learn from each other. How do other people tackle problems? I always go at it this way, but actually I know how Jill deals with it within our group, and she always approaches it in a completely different way. So they learn from each other's problem solving skills. And another aspect of individual development can be about emotional intelligence. As we go along, do post questions that occur to you, and we can come back to them once we finish the session, but you might forget about them unless we capture them as we go along. So I can see one about using it with teams, and we can come back to that later. So those are all examples of individual development. Organizational development. So action learning, traditionally used for individuals, has moved, I think, quite often now to being used as part of an organized development program. A classic would be service improvement. So very early on, action learning was used within the NHS, and I know we've got some NHS people with us today, where you get different providers of a service to come together and talk about what needs to change from each of their perspectives. So they get to understand how the whole service works, and what they might each contribute to service improvement. Cross-functional working would be another example of organizational development, and this is often a driver for action learning, where you have departments who don't speak to each other, regional offices who've got complaints about headquarters. I guess we all know it in large organizations, the kinds of things that can arise. So how can you get people to work across departments? An example from the charity sector, we went into Scope and worked with them on how you reduced silo working. And many years ago, Cancer Research UK started using action learning, and they now use it in all of their programs. But at the beginning, part of what they wanted to do was find a way for different departments to talk to each other. They'd never had a way that, say, for example, fundraisers could talk to scientists as peers. So action learning provided that peer group. We're often used for culture change programs. So, for example, Oxford University Press or the Body Shop and L'Oreal, they wanted to introduce more of a coaching culture when L'Oreal took over Body Shop, and how could they learn from each other's culture? And action learning was used to bring people together across the two companies. You might aim action learning at a particular tier of management. So in Rethink, a number of years back, we worked with the regional managers who were crucial for winning contracts, but who were actually quite isolated in their role. And they recognised that when they spent time together, mostly what they did was, and they don't mind me saying this, but mostly what they did was just moan. So have a half day of moaning together. And they recognised that that wasn't the best use of the time they had, and they needed a more structured process and something that was slightly more constructive. So we went and were invited to do action learning with them on a regular basis. You can bring people together around a theme. You can bring people together because they're all having to deal with change management. Again, that's often a reason why action learning is introduced. And if I give you an example from the civil service, we were asked by DEFRA to come in and help their managers implement the big changes that were happening within the civil service. So they gave them seminars, they gave them online materials. So they had all of these resources, but where do they go to talk about how do I actually do it? What do I do when this has happened with my team? So action learning was provided for that purpose. And a last one I'll mention under organisational development is where you've got acquisitions, mergers, restructures, big organisational change. Okay, I can see some questions coming in, some great questions about measuring the benefits and students. So thanks very much for the questions. Okay, so I'm going to now talk about business projects. So you can use action learning to bring project managers together, and the project managers could either be working on different projects and using the action learning to compare their experience and to learn from each other, or they may be working on a common project. So we worked recently with an organisation, a company called Sandvik Coromant, and there were a number of senior managers who'd been given projects that were business turnaround projects of crucial importance to the future of the business. And they needed to collaborate on those projects because they each ran big regions, and they needed to make sure that what they were doing fitted together. So we worked with them, and because they came together from across the UK, we worked with them in action learning that was for 24 hours, not the whole 24 hours, but they met for 24 hours, and we did action learning with them every couple of months. Another example of a business project, not action learning that we did, but has been written up, and I've spoken to the person who ran it, was action learning with Microsoft. And there they used it as part of a leadership program, and each person on the program in groups were given a business project, something that was real. They had to report back to it to the sponsor, who was a senior member of the company, but part of their leadership was to be given a challenge to solve for the company, and they used action learning as the way that they would do that. So let's come now to networking. And this, well, we often know that networking doesn't really work, that you go to these network events and actually it's dominated by the same few people, or it gets kind of stuck in some way. So sometimes it really helps to offer people a structure for networking. We worked a lot in the cultural sector with an organisation called the Cultural Leadership Programme, and their experience was that whether or not networks work depended on the level of facilitation skills that existed within that network. And so what they did was invest in a program of action learning facilitation so that action learning could be used within the networks. We quite often work with alumni. So we're working on a number of very exciting fellowship programs. An example would be the CLAW Social Leadership Program, which is all about investing in leaders of the third sector. And we've worked with CLAW Social Leadership since the very beginning, since it was set up about 7 years ago. And they've discovered that action learning is one of the core elements that people really value from their programs, and they've invested in it over a period of time. A really exciting program that we're working with at the moment is the Atlantic Fellowship, which is based at the London School of Economics, and those are global leaders of social change wanting to spend more time, and very well funded by an American philanthropist who's interested in changing the world, which is very exciting. And those people on the Atlantic Fellowships need to create a peer network that's going to last beyond the end of the fellowship at NSC. So again, they're using action learning as a way of building a peer network, so people can focus on what's really important to them. So you could have a network that works across organisations or within a sector. So for example, we've worked in the homelessness sector in London. Let me come on to higher education. So we've worked with a number of universities in Scotland with their learning and development teams because they're wanting to use action learning as part of a number of programs for staff development. The other ways in which action learning is used in higher education, and not ones that we particularly run, are very often it's used as part of an MBA program or Masters in Organisational Development. Both Roffey and Ashridge use action learning. We've had experience of working with somebody who tried out using action learning with PhD students. So he was a professor and found that it was a really valuable way of them learning from each other and obviously a more efficient use of his time. And that blog by Trevor Marchant is on our website. You might be interested if you're an academic in looking at that. And there's also research questions that can be explored through action learning. So you can gather qualitative data using action learning, obviously with the agreement of the participants that what you gather is not confidential, but is going to be used for the purpose of the research. So let me come on to supervision. I've already mentioned action learning with mentors, and we've used action learning, for example, at the Body Shop, where the mentors did a mentoring program, but then came into an action learning set to talk about how they did it in practice. You know, what were the challenges of working with their mentees? There are a number of coaching organisations who are using action learning as a follow-up to their coaching training, and working with coaches can be a useful way of providing either support or possibly supervision for those coaches. And I've mentioned social work practice before. We've worked with a county council where the purpose of action learning was both to look at the quality of work that was being done, but also to provide supervision to people. So social change. This is stuff that really excites me. So you can use action learning at grassroots level to make change happen. For example, we've worked in South Africa with in KwaZulu-Natal with women's groups working with HIV/AIDS, and teaching them a kind of modified, teaching the workers with those groups a modified version of action learning that they could take into the community. There's a brilliant example of action learning being used for community development in Wales that's been written up into a book, and again we didn't deliver it, and a lot was done in the Welsh language, but really exciting, where action learning was introduced originally because of the high suicide level of hill farmers, and then it extended to the hill farmers' wives and to their sons and daughters. So action learning was really spread across the country in a very interesting development. We've used more about action learning. Sorry, I'm getting distracted by your questions. There were some great questions and we'll come back to them. We've also used action learning in the Middle East, where it was about empowering young women. And those young women were then able to take action learning back into their community organisations. So this was in Lebanon, and we worked across Palestinian and Lebanese communities. And in fact, it was the first time they'd sat down together, these young women in a group, and were trained as action learning facilitators. That was funded by Oxfam. And one last example of social change is we worked with UN Habitat on the land and housing rights for Muslim women. So they wanted to explore how you extend those rights in a way that doesn't conflict with Sharia law. And obviously a very sensitive issue, and people coming at it from lots of different perspectives: academics, civil society, activists, NGOs. And there needed to be a way of them listening to each other and participating in a discussion with each other without falling into traditional kind of adversarial positions. So action learning opened up a way for them to relate to each other differently. So virtual action learning. This is a way in which action learning can be applied where distance is an element, or where time for travel is an element, or cost. You can think about using action learning virtually, and certainly a lot of our work has shifted towards being virtual action learning, and there are obvious benefits, and it enables people to work from different countries together and to learn from each other. So I think you might have you might work with an assumption, maybe not if as you signed up to this webinar, but you may work with an assumption that action learning is always better face to face. And we've really had to challenge ourselves. I know I have, and I might have started off with that assumption. I certainly don't have it anymore. It can work just as well virtually. So we use Zoom as a platform for that, but it can be teleconference, it can be audio or visual. And I think we also have realised that you don't have to have people meeting face to face first and then continuing virtually, that it's possible to provide action learning from the beginning in a virtual environment. Okay, so the benefits to individuals, I think it might be apparent really from the examples that I've been describing. Essentially is about giving people a group of peers. And what people get back from those peers is very different from what they might get back from their immediate work colleagues or from their partner. People who come at it in a different way. So structured reflection time, support and challenge, and we've talked about coaching and feedback skills. So the impact on organisational performance, again, I hope you can see from the examples that we've given and what I've described about the process, why these might be true. And what Helen said at the Body Shop, it really changed the way that she was running her team meetings. So these are benefits: cross-organisational learning, a self-sustaining network for peer development. So action learning sets can end up being self-facilitated and going on for many years, which is so the initial investment in action learning is worth it for the companies. Okay, time for your questions. And apologies, that's a run through of action learning, and we could really spend the whole day talking about how it can be applied. But some of the questions I've heard so far are about teams. Just to say that we will be in touch with you afterwards, and we can send you we'll send you a recording of this talk. So can you use it with teams? It's complicated if you're the team leader, and if you've got 3 hours once a month, then I think that might be quite difficult to do action learning. You would probably not want to combine it with other business, but allocate some time specifically for action learning. But I'd say you probably need to spend a whole day at some point for everyone to get familiar with the process before you could then adapt it within the team. And there is potentially a conflict of interest between you, if you're the team leader, them being an action learning facilitator. But I'm very happy to have a more of a conversation with you about that, Joy, because yeah, I deliberately didn't put teams up there because it is fairly complicated. We'd say that you definitely need 2.5 to 3 hours minimum. Sometimes we work with people for a whole day. But yeah, you can't do action learning really in much less time than that. Is it appropriate to inject problems and scenarios, or should they always be brought into by the individuals themselves? No, we would say that you should always work with real life stuff rather than creating a scenario. That's probably a bit of the core of action learning, that it's real life and it is a problem or a situation faced by one of the participants in that group, and they then take responsibility for implementing the action. You might have them explore situations around a theme, so you might inject the theme and then invite people to put forward situations that are real to them around that theme. Yeah, how do you, Nicola asks, how do you move forward with an individual's development when they haven't actioned their actions? Yeah, so as a group meets over a period of time, they get to know each other very well. And if someone kind of comes back to the next meeting and says, oh yes, I took away 6 actions, I didn't do any of them, well then the next time they presented a different topic, you would ask them different kinds of questions. And you probably get them to make a different kind of commitment towards action. So that's the way in which people become accountable to each other. Can I use this with sixth form students? Becky. Again, it's slightly complicated, and I'm very happy to have a further conversation with you about this. Yes, I think in principle you can. It's a very powerful tool, and so I think the danger of using it with younger people, or people who haven't kind of got the emotional resources to offer each other questions and feedback, might be that it could get misused, or people may not fully respect trust and the confidentiality that's needed. The danger with a teacher using it is that they may not be able to step out of their teacher role. They may be seen and they may experience themselves as the expert, whereas as an action learning facilitator, you're not the expert. You're part of the group, you're holding the structure, but you're part of the group and asking questions. And if people think that you've got the answers to those questions really, then it may not work. But I'm not a teacher, and I have known teachers who have incorporated aspects of action learning into what they're doing. I guess the PhD example would be one that'd be worth you looking at, because what Trevor found was that the kinds of issues that people brought were very similar, and they learned a lot from each other. Okay, so sorry, I'm just trying to see the questions. So Paula is asking about the advantages of action learning over other types of group interactions. Yes, I guess we work with people who are very used to being in groups sometimes, and who are really overwhelmed by the feeling of this is something completely different, or people who spend their lives in meetings and in discussing topics, and when they come to action learning they are really, wow, this is amazing. It's much more powerful, it's much clearer what you need to do, what each person is taking away to do. They own the actions that they take. We get to a different level of depth because we've just explored one person's perspective. So although it might be a shared issue, you're just exploring it through one person's perspective, and then other people at the end talk about what they have learned from the process. And very often they each take away, if they're working in one organisation, for example, or in one sector, they may each take away actions that comes from the learning of exploring one person in depth. I'm wondering if there's other questions that I can pick up. Sorry, just how to measure the organisational benefits of action learning. Yes, I think this is quite challenging because there often isn't a kind of straightforward line between this has come out of action learning. Sometimes there is. So we would work with the Commissioner of Action Learning as to why they wanted to introduce action learning, whether action learning was in fact the right tool or process. and then how they would know whether it had been successful. So some simple success criteria from the commissioners. And then we'd work with the participants. Why do they want to do action learning? And what do they want to get out of it? And how will they know if it's better at the end? And then we would ask them to assess that. And with the commissioner, we might find some ways of assessing that. So we have sometimes used other tools to measure organisational benefits. And again, I'm going to say, okay, there's more on the website, and we also run a day around this. So it's a big topic, but there are ways in which you can do it. And a kind of before and after linked to 360. In some organisations, there are straightforward measures of performance that you can look at to see whether action learnings make a difference. So I feel like that's a very inadequate answer to a big topic, but I hope it gives you a taste for it. And again, I'm happy to have a follow-up. Okay, sorry, I'm just running down the list and seeing what how to get staff to buy in, because the initial feedback suggests some staff think it's a form of management spying. That's an interesting one. We haven't had that ever. I think that the ground rule around confidentiality needs to be really clear, really explicit, and also explicit with the commissioner, with the person who's commissioned the action learning, that they need to understand that they're not going to get anything back on content. They may talk to people about the process and what they're individually getting from it, but they're not going to get any content. And the participants really need to trust the facilitator. That's why there can be a conflict of interest if the facilitator is also their manager. That's not a straightforward one. But yeah, we would spend a long time on the setup, on getting people to trust each other. Even if it's going to be action learning for 2.5, 3 hour sessions, we'd encourage people to have a whole day on the setup and really explore this confidentiality issue, because otherwise I think it's not going to work if people feel like it's management spying. I would say there is that really valuable information that comes out of action learning, and with the agreement of the set, you can report back on that to people more senior in the organisation. So we'll often do that either in the form of a report or with the set or with us presenting the themes that are emerging. But it needs to be with the agreement of all the participants, and sometimes them all individually signing off the content of that report. How is it different from group coaching? There are some similarities, and the process is probably similar, except that you don't focus on a common issue that the group identifies. You explore an issue through one individual's perspective on that situation. Ben asks about facilitating a group of peers who all know each other, and they'd be a virtual groups. I thought I recognised your name. Hello, Ben. They'd be a virtual group and they'd be in different countries. So we do offer, an ad here, we do offer action learning facilitated training virtually. We've got another program starting in the new year, and that would be a good way of getting some experience in virtual action learning, because you do have to flex your skills slightly and probably be a bit more directive if you're facilitating virtually. But that sounds like a great sort of thing to do then. Okay, Janet, I see your request, and yes, happy to pass on information about the day that we do on identifying the benefits. So that's been a really great session. Thank you very much for your participation in it.